Well, we're back, and we're going to begin what may strike you as a diversion from our intended goal of learning about the biology of hope and belief, but alas, it turns out that in order to understand either one, we have to have a little bit of information about how humans process this kind of information and thought. And to do that, we need to know something about the nervous system. Now, if you are, perchance, a psychology major, you've had all this stuff. In fact, you probably can safely ignore much of what I'm about to say. But for the rest of you, particularly those who have not had grounding in biology, we're going to spend a total of 3 modules talking about this. And for some of you, this will be the most difficult part of the course. But I promise to tone it down and not ask of you things that we would ask of a biology major, for instance. You'll not be asked to solve a problem with the Nernst equation, for instance. We're going to really focus on the big picture here. But we do need to know something about the nervous system and how it's set up and how it functions in order to get a grip on those issues that are relevant to this course. So I'm going to promise you something I cannot deliver, namely that talking about the nervous system and the ability to perceive things in the real world will lead us to an understanding of those ineffable things like the mind, the body, the spirit, the soul, all that stuff. Well, nobody can really tell you what that means, but at least we can talk about it with some greater degree of clarity if we first talk about the nervous system. So that's why we're going to do this. And again, for those of you who take part in these conversations, these modules, in other words, and find it to be mind-boggling and scary, don't worry. You're going to have 3 of these things to get through. Once you get through them, you're more or less done with it except for the final exam. And so it'll be a breeze from here on out. But I like to get these more difficult presentations out of the way up front so that once you're done with this, you've got free sailing. It's like no big deal. So with that in mind, let's get started. This is a presentation broken up for you in 4 convenient parts, during the first of which we're going to talk about the classic robot experience. It's an actual experiment done by actual scientists, and it teaches us a lot about the differences between those things that have a brain and those things that do not. So we'll start with that. Then we'll go on to talk about the basic functions of the nervous system in living organisms that have it. We'll continue on with a discussion of the evolution of the nervous system in organisms that have them, and conclude with some remarks on the importance of the type and number of neurons and what those characteristics mean for the nervous system. So with that, let us begin. All right, we're going to talk about this classic experiment involving a very early robot. It's easily 20 years old, perhaps even a bit older than that. And what these folks were doing, they were in the realm of artificial intelligence, and they created this little bot and given it ambulatory functions, as well as having programmed its microchip so that it could respond to various commands. And the idea here was that the investigators took this robot and they put it at one end of a room and told it to move across the room and open a door on the other side. So it was a relatively simple task for which it had the requisite technology at its disposal. It had the ability to respond to programming commands, and it had the ability to move. And then when it got to the other side of the room, to actually physically open the door. So that was what they hoped to do, and they wanted to monitor the robot's progress in understanding and responding to the commands it was given. So it was a simple task, but in the hands, if it in fact had hands, of the robot, it was an absolutely mind-bogglingly complicated and daunting task. Why is this? Well, the robot took its initial foray forward as it was commanded to do, but at each imperceptible advance of the robot, it had to completely restudy its orientation in the room. It had to visually calculate and evaluate the angles. Was it still on the floor? Was the ceiling still up there? What about the walls of the room? Were they still there? All of these things had to be assessed by the little robot, and until he had done this and determined that, yes, all is well, I'm still where I am, I can take the next advance forward. Let's say it was 2 millimeters, not a very big distance, but enough to then occasion the robot to have to redo all of these orientation functions again and again and again. So you can imagine that the graduate students in charge of this project were thinking, okay, let's go get a beer because this is taking forever and there's nothing we can do to move this along. So yeah, it was probably not the most interesting thing to watch, but it was part of the experiment, and if you're in charge of it, this is what you get to do with your very exciting life. So the poor little robot does this again and again, and even when confronted with change that we would probably consider to be imperceptible, it wasn't imperceptible to the robot. It was a really big change, causing great consternation and the reinitiation of these functions of evaluating its orientation in space and time so that it could make the next move forward in pursuit of its goal of opening that darn door. So it took hours, something like 12 hours, for this robot to roll across a distance of 10 or 12 feet. But it finally gets to the other side of the room, and it dutifully opens the door. No big deal. Mission accomplished. But now, because they are scientists, and scientists like to do creepy things, the scientists took our little intrepid robot and it put it back at the starting line on the other side of the room, and it told the robot, okay, go open that door again. But this time, the door was emblazoned with a big black X. So, to the humans involved, this is like no big deal. Yeah, it's a door. It's got an X. Who cares? Whatever. But to the robot, it caused complete confusion, leading to it not being able to function. Because why? Well, the robot knew nothing of X's. What is this thing you call X? I know not. It could not generalize from its previous experience. It could not evaluate and conclude that the X in the door didn't affect its functions. It could easily still open the door. It could not learn. And as a result, the poor robot turns away from the door, dejected and absolutely unable to accomplish the task that it was given. So this brings us to a stark reality. For that robot, no matter how good its programming, any change meant total change because it didn't have the information in its databanks to evaluate the X on the door and make the decision that it didn't fundamentally change what it was being asked to do. His previous, I don't know why I called it a he, but I did, its previous experience did not provide meaningful information against which it could judge the current task and generalize a door was a door. It wasn't capable of learning that idea in this experiment. And certainly, the kinds of robots that we have today are vastly better than the robots that we're talking about 20 or 30 years ago. But the point I'm trying to make is that even if we allow for the monumental improvement in artificial intelligence and in robotic technology and so forth that have taken place in the intervening 20 or 30 years, even if we allow for that vast change, even the best robots that we could produce today couldn't come close to handling what a typical 2-year-old toddler child could execute, or even a comparatively lowly, simple mouse. Its brain is eminently more capable of absorbing and processing information than is the best robot that we have today. And even an ant, which we think of as a mindless automaton much of the time, is much better capable of understanding information that comes in through the environment and responding appropriately, having evaluated the nature of that information. So we've got something really interesting going on once we get this thing called a brain and its attendant nervous system that supports it. In contrast to the robot, which is a human construction, a living organism has this incredibly difficult task of receiving an endless stream of constantly changing sensory information from the external environment. And it is absolutely essential that that organism be able to take this information in and evaluate its importance. And then it has to, having evaluated that information, act appropriately. One of the big things you find out when you study animals is that much of their day, much of their nervous system activity is spent deciding what information they can conveniently ignore. And you do this all the time too. You're sitting at home, maybe in the kitchen. There's a whole bunch of noise going on. Maybe there's a fan in the ceiling that's keeping the room cool. Maybe there's an air conditioner. The stove might be making noise. The refrigerator makes a humming sound. All of these things are sensory input that your brain has to assess and react appropriately to, and you probably won't respond to any of these things because you've learned to block them out. They're just background noise. We don't pay attention. However, if the smoke alarm goes off, bam, you're right on it because the place is on fire. You want to take appropriate action. And in the environment, an organism's survival is absolutely dependent on this function, evaluating what you need to know, responding appropriately to ensure your survival. That is the first job, major job, of the nervous system. But organisms, including humans, have a second major task too, and that is to maintain the internal consistency of their inside environment. Your body is an amazing thing. It does all sorts of things that you don't even think about. And one major part of that goal is to maintain all of the functions that are going on inside your body, inside each cell, within certain prescribed biological limits. We call these limits homeostasis, meaning maintenance of the same state. And it includes all sorts of things that you basically don't think about much of the time. Things such as body temperature, which is one of the few functions that you might think about because your body temperature regularly fluctuates when you exercise or when you're out in the cold, and so you have to learn ways to adjust what's going on so that your body isn't undone or severely impacted in a negative way by changing temperature. So that's one you might think about, but you probably don't think about the water level in your cells so much. You don't think about the pH in your stomach. There are all sorts of things going on all the time. All these body regulatory functions, all of them have limits within which these functions need to take place. Otherwise, you get into trouble. And I think it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. A lot of these functions are set up, particularly in advanced vertebrates like humans, in such a way that we don't have to think about them. And that's a really good thing. You have an autonomic nervous system that takes care of all this stuff so that you don't have to give it a thought. And that's good because, for instance, if you had to remember to breathe at some point, you would have forgotten, and you would therefore not be listening to this module today. So the nervous system does all of these boring, thankless things that we never have to think about, and it's a really good thing that it does. So, if we compare, let's say, vertebrates, things that have a vertebral column, with other less developed organisms, they might have a nervous system, but not one like a vertebrate does, we can start to look at some stark differences in those different kinds of organisms. All organisms have these same very basic needs, and first among them is to avoid being eaten by some other organism, because that pretty much ruins your day and means you will not be going on to the next part of our game here. But in addition to avoiding predation, organisms have to find, eat, and then process food from which you derive energy to run your cells. A good thing. If you're successful in avoiding predation and getting the necessary resources for life, including not only food but water, then you would have to find a mate so that you can reproduce yourself and send your genes into the next generation. Of course, you need some sort of shelter in which you can shelter your body from inclement weather and so forth. So basically, all of the organisms that we're going to be interested in have those 4 basic survival functions, plus some others that we're not going to talk about because, life is short. But if we look at higher level vertebrates, and here we include humans, of course, but some other vertebrates as well. We might include dogs, we might include cats, we might include whales or chimpanzees or porpoises. In addition to the survival functions, they have some other really interesting things at their disposal. Many of them can perform music of various sorts. Humans are not the only animals that can do this. Others can as well. And if we compare the possibilities for vertebrates against our intrepid little robot, we find that virtually all of the activities that these higher level vertebrates can do are monstrously difficult. If you had to write a computer program to process the kinds of things that advanced vertebrates could do, you'd be at it for quite a long time. And you'd be a genius, and you'd make a lot of money because nobody's figured out how to do that yet. If we make a distinction between simple organisms as capable of doing the first 4 things we've talked about on this list, we can distinguish them from the more complicated creatures because we and other species that I just mentioned can do some really complicated, arcane, not necessary for survival kinds of things that include artistic kinds of things. Okay, so what are those things that organisms can do that a robot or some lower level animal cannot do? And how is that possible? What is the explanation that provides the distinction between low-level processing or survival-based functions and the higher order cognitive or executive kinds of functions that advanced vertebrates like us are capable of? Well, basically, the difference is we have these networks of neurons that form the nervous system that have the very important function of signal transduction of sensory input and other kinds of input. And once the signal is received, the organisms can process that signal and do a whole variety of different things in response. One thing they might do is compare it to previous experience. In advanced vertebrates, such as ourselves, and the other things I mentioned previously, those organisms can formulate a strategic response so that whatever the problem that arises can be taken care of. And we'll give some more examples in greater detail in a few minutes. But the point is that you have this incredible thing called a nervous system that consists of these neurons that allows you to execute all of these very sophisticated, not easy to replicate kinds of functions within the vertebrate body. And this has been shaped by millennia through the force of natural selection and has really come to fruition in terms of cognitive abilities and perhaps some extra cognitive abilities, thought processes that are really important to the way the vertebrate mind works. So, if we look at sort of a spectrum of different possibilities for the nervous system, the nervous system as we understand it basically begins in the lowly worms and other organisms like starfish, where you have a very, very basic level of nervous system that I'll go over in more detail in a minute. Now, as an aside, there are entire classes of really sophisticated organisms that lack a nervous system completely. And these are, by and large, the more advanced plants. The angiosperms, or flowering plants, are a great example. They have no nervous system, but they can do all of the homeostatic functions and survival functions even without it. So why have a nervous system if you can have a beautiful lilac tree or daisy flower or rosebush? If you can have those organisms without a nervous system, why did we bother to invest in an in a nervous system? And we're going to be taking that up in a few minutes because it's a really important question. Why is the nervous system so valuable to us that we would not want to forego it entirely like even advanced plants has? Why do we have this nervous system? Well, the basic answer is this. Once the organisms on Earth stopped being just unicellular organisms, in other words, very early life on Earth, in fact, for the first 3 billion years of existence of life on Earth, all of the organisms present had a single cell. But eventually, after 3 billion years of trying and retrying the single cell approach to life, cells began to group together and form multicellular forms. And even small multicellular forms could exist pretty much as multicellular animals, a group of loosely joined cells that shared some functions between cells. But by the time you get to the really complicated organisms that have hundreds of millions of cells in their composition, all of a sudden getting important information from one end of the organism, like the head, to the big toe, was really complicated, and it couldn't be done efficiently using the kinds of processes that were available to single-celled organisms or even advanced plants like the angiosperms. So once organisms, particularly animal organisms, became multicellular, the processes by which a message could be communicated from one part of the organism to another was simply too slow for the large organisms to respond quickly to changes in the internal or external environments. And this problem was solved by developing a nervous system which allows for, at least in our time scale, the nearly instantaneous transmission of a message from the head to the toe. It's like when you walk into a room and flip on the light switch, it's nearly instantaneous that the light goes on. Now, yes, I know that there is a finite, teeny tiny period of time during which there's no light after you flip the switch, but it's so fast it might as well be instantaneous. And that's the way the nervous system behaves in a vertebrate body. So let's talk a little bit about the evolution of that nervous system from the relatively simple forms with which it started to the very advanced forms like that which humans have. All told, there are two basic types of nervous systems. We call these diffuse. On the one hand, this is the primitive form, and the other alternative modality is to have a centralized nervous system. So in the case of a diffuse nervous system, I wonder if I can get my little, yeah, there we go, pen going here. Okay, so an organism with a diffuse nervous system is something like the sea anemone that you see here. It's just this bundle of little spaghetti-like lines. Those are the neurons, the nerve cells. And they're not highly organized. They're just kind of there like a net, like a hair net, something like that. Another example of a diffuse nervous system is the starfish you see here. And it looks a little bit more organized than this sea anemone, and it probably is. It's a little bit more advanced. But both of these animals, both the sea anemone and the sea star, are radially symmetric. They're not, you can't draw a single line down the body of these animals and get two equal halves because they have many planes of symmetry by which they can be divided in half. So they're fundamentally different from other kinds of animals. The other kind of nervous system, the centralized nervous system, is more common. It's the more advanced, and here are some animals. Hey, look at all these red lines. I could really get carried away here. Okay, so these are all animals that have a centralized nervous system, but even if we're talking about a centralized nervous system where large numbers of neurons are gathered together into functional units, there are still some fairly cosmic differences between primitive and advanced centralized nervous systems. So we'll talk about those right now. In terms of the evolution of the nervous system, even those which are centralized, we would begin with the flatworms. They are the least developed organisms with a centralized nervous system. And what makes this a centralized nervous system is that we have a brain, which is an amalgamation of a whole bunch of neurons into a single unit that has specific functions associated with it. This is a primitive organism because we have two nerve cords extending from the brain. So this is the inaugural step in the formation of an advanced nervous system, but it is not yet fully advanced because of the characteristics I mentioned. We then move into the annelids, or the earthworms, which you see down here, and now we have a completely centralized brain. It's this one in the flatworms consists basically of two halves. Well, in the earthworm, the two halves have fused together, so it's more highly centralized. We also have only one nerve cord coming out of the brain instead of two, although we have highly segmented helper brains or ganglia that run along the length of this single nerve cord. So it's more advanced than the flatworms, but less advanced compared to what comes after it. And what does come after it? Well, the next step in this evolutionary trajectory would be the giant squid, which you see here. Where is my line? There it is. Here is our squid, and you can see that this is really nicely centralized. We have a nice big brain. We also have eyes in the squid. Who knew? We have some ganglia left along the central nerve cord, but more importantly, what we now have is a whole bunch of peripheral nerves that come off the central nerve cord and innervate other parts of the body. So those are some of the developments that make this a higher organism, that is to say the squid, than that which came before it. And lastly, we get to the pinnacle of vertebrate evolution, and we have the human being. And we now see a very important thing happening up here in the brain. This is our major advance. We call this a cephalized nervous system because all of the executive functions are gathered and put into the brain, and because the word in Latin for brain is cephalus, if we say a nervous system is cephalized, it means that all of the important stuff, well, that's not entirely true. All of the executive functions and regulatory functions are given to the brain, which is in the head, and therefore is called cephalic. So the human nervous system, the vertebrate nervous system, is not only centralized, it's cephalized. So, as I mentioned, and to recapitulate, the evolution of simple nervous systems started with the flatworms, which were the first bilaterally symmetrical systems. Although we still had two longitudinal nerve cords. Boy, can I speak in English? Help me. Then we moved on to from the flatworms to the annelid worms, the earthworms, that are moderately centralized. They had a very distinct brain with some ganglia coming off the brain. And then we moved on to the more advanced stuff, of which we are the pinnacle. So prior to getting to humans, we had further cephalization, concentration of executive functions in the brain. We had some other things start to show up, like eyes, certainly important, and control of specific functions, things like locomotion or motion and feeding, get compartmentalized and concentrated in the highly centralized nervous system in the brain. So additional examples, in addition to the squid, are octopuses have a highly centralized nervous system, as do insects. Yes, insects do have a nervous system. Who knew? And lastly, we get to us, where we have lots more neurons present, a very high degree of centralization, as you would expect, but also this thing called cephalization, which is the concentration of all of these important functions in the brain itself. We also have the division of our highly cephalized brain into distinct units. We have lobes that are associated with particular functions like olfaction or executive function in the forebrain, the conscious thought, ability to reason, that sort of thing in the forebrain. I mentioned the 5 regions of the brain, which we'll go over again in another lecture. And, of course, because we have all of these amazingly important functions now residing in a single location, in the vertebrate brain, we've gone to an awful lot of trouble to protect the brain by the use of a skull and several other adaptations whose function is to preserve the integrity of the brain against assault. So, in terms of vertebrate nervous systems and the characteristics I just mentioned, we're talking about all of the things from fish, which are vertebrates, to us, which are vertebrates. Now, at this point, it's a good time to mention that there are 3 kinds of neurons. The nervous system, as you might expect, is composed of these cells called neurons. And despite the multitude of functions that these neurons have to carry out, there are only 3 different types of neurons, irrespective of which kind of organism we're talking about. So what are they? Well, they are, first of all, the sensory neurons, which have the job of carrying information, not surprisingly, from the sense organs to the brain and the spinal cord. And these are the things that help us perceive things that are going on in the external environment, and by taking the information up the spinal cord and then to the brain, where the information gets analyzed and a response is formulated, we have the ability to take whatever response is appropriate given the information at hand. So these are very important neurons in helping us respond to and perceiving the environment. Secondly, we have motor neurons, which carry messages from the brain and the spinal cord back to muscles and glands, which are in the periphery. This is important because, as I mentioned, you receive information from the environment through your sense organs, feed that information to the brain analyzes it and figures out what response you should take. And one response you might take is to decide, you know what, danger, danger, get out of here. And then the brain would send a message using your motor neurons to your muscles saying, get the heck out of Dodge. There's danger. And that's kind of how it works. Finally, we have these things called interneurons because, if you're sending a message from your brain to your big toe, that's a lot of space to cover. And so your response might start out in the brain feeding information to the spinal cord and thence to a motor neuron, but probably if you're sending the message a long way, then the motor neuron would be given the information by an interneuron that would serve as an intermediary messenger between the spinal cord and the motor neuron that generates the response. So even though the stuff we're going to be talking about is incredibly complicated, the basic machinery used to perform those functions is pretty simple. We're always talking about neurons of one form or another, and there's only 3. How hard can this be, I ask you? So here's an individual neuron, and it very nicely shows the important structure of the neuron that I'm going to want you to be familiar with. First of all, we have what we would call a cell body. And this is the part of the cell that contains all of those organelles that you learned about in basic biology class that carry out the important functions of running the cell. Things like the nucleus, the mitochondria, the Golgi bodies, the ER, all of that stuff is contained here in the cell body, which is also known as a soma in the case of a neuron. So that's the first important part of the cell I want you to know about. The second part of the cell, which is distinct to cells that are neurons, are these highly branched functions that branch off or come off of the cell body. And these are given the name dendrites. They're very important because they serve as part of the mechanism that helps this neuron communicate with other neurons. So that's the second important part, the dendrites. They're distinguished by the fact that they have all these little branches on them. And incidentally, the word dendrite comes from the root dendrology. Dendrology is a study of trees. Trees have branches, and that's why these highly branched processes were named dendrites, because biologists are very clever. I am sure you will agree. Okay, the third important part of the neuron is this long, unbranched process, which we call an axon, A-X-O-N. At the end of the axon, we do see some branches, but it's not the same as the dendrite, which is branched throughout its length. So this third important part is called the axon. Now over here you see a whole bunch of neurons together. So these things, these big yellow globs, are the cell bodies, and all the rest of these spaghetti-like hairy processes things are the collection of axons and dendrites that join these neurons together. And don't worry, we'll talk about this again. Oh, joy, I hear you cry. So if we add it all up and try to account for the difference between, let's say, a nematode and a man, it's actually pretty easy. It's simply the number of neurons and the structural arrangement in the nervous system. So basically, the greater the number of neurons an organism has, the greater the complexity of that organism's thought processes, and the greater the potential range of adaptive responses to any particular stimulus will be. So if we take, for instance, a flatworm that faces mortal danger, its primary mode of dealing with that problem is simply to leave the area, to get away, to flee, if it can do so. However, if we're talking about a human facing mortal danger, the human responses are much more nuanced and may include things like prevention. Don't go into an area where danger lurks, for instance. But having been presented with danger, you can then form a plot to escape. Or maybe you had the foresight to bring a weapon with you. So those would be additional avenues by which you could avoid the danger that is present. Or maybe you got your cell phone on you, because God knows all youth have a cell phone. I don't understand this. My children feel naked without their phones. I'm perfectly happy with a rotary phone that hangs on the wall, but I'm old. Okay, so if you've got your phone on you, you can, do a quick dial to a friend and say, help me, send the cops, whatever. And so you have this other modality by which you can respond because you've got these extra neurons and a highly centralized and cephalized brain. Good job. So as the complexity of a species' brain increases in the vertebrate lineage, the number of neurons also increases. And that is the one major characteristic of increased executive function with higher numbers of neurons. In addition, the existing neurons become even more intimately entangled through the elaboration of dendrites. In other words, the number of connections between the neurons that exist in highly complicated species also increases. In addition, as the number of neurons increase, they also begin to cluster in these specialized units that we were talking about, and that increases, again, the sophistication of processing that is possible in that brain. So circuits develop among various structures within a highly sophisticated vertebrate brain, and the idea behind the circuits is to be able to rapidly share and trade information in a rich, multi-layered perception and potential response to the world. And really advanced vertebrates have an additional thing which we call memory that can be used to make future decisions based on things that have been happening in the past and were stored in the brain. So you can see that as the number of neurons increases, we have no idea what kind of memory a flatworm has. Probably not much. Probably most of its functions are instinctual in nature. But by the time you get to humans, we can log all this information into our data banks. We can store it. We might modify it if there's an emotional attachment to it, or if there's a learning function that goes with it. We've got all of this function that we can use to give ourselves multiple options for any situation that arises. In fact, the human brain is so darn complex that we can do amazing. I cannot emphasize how incredibly amazing all of these things are. It's not just survival that we're looking at. Humans want to do all sorts of other things like anticipate the future. Think about how amazing that is. We not only know that a future exists, we can imagine different outcomes for that future. We can play different scenarios in our minds. And once we've done that, we might take actions born of our internal desires and our memories and our life history to secure a particular outcome in that future. It's an amazing thing because it requires the integration of all things like memories of our experiences. We might not even have our own memories. We might have memories that are given to us by stories, by the sharing of other people's experiences and desires and attitudes through language, through books, or through sitting at the dinner table listening to stories from our collective pasts. It's amazing. So we get these ideas that don't even come from our own experience, but from other people's, and we integrate them into our data banks. Humans also have perhaps a unique ability, we're not really sure about this, to conceive of really things that you can't really see necessarily, but you know it when you see it, to paraphrase a Supreme Court justice. So we can conceive of things like beauty. What is beauty? Does a flatworm think of beauty? Does a sheep? I don't know. Certainly humans do. I think there's some birds that probably do because they certainly invest a lot of energy in making beautiful males to be attractive to females who choose normally the sexual departments. So, we've got some some other organisms that might have a sense of beauty, but humans at least have the ability to not only see it, but write about it or make representations of it. It's kind of amazing. We've also cultivated a moral sense, an idea that some things are right and some things are wrong. Now here we do not stand alone. There are other organisms among the vertebrates who also have a moral sense, but in humans it comes to full flower, or if not full flower, we at least know what's morally correct. We just don't always do it, but there's that. We understand virtue, we understand good and evil, we are at least hopeful that we will choose the good and not the evil, but as you know, that doesn't always happen either. Even more importantly and more interestingly, we have this massive creative sense. Humans are by their very nature artists, and this comes into play very early on in the human lineage, where people were drawing pictures on cave walls and making pots, and even when they were doing something fairly proletarian like making a weapon, often they decorated it just to make it pretty. Obviously it didn't improve its function, but it made it look pretty. That's what humans are. We have this genius and this inspirational sense that motivates us to do these really, really interesting things. And then beyond that, we've got this organization of society that is not the product of biological entities. We've created a culture. We have a complicated economic system. We have different economic systems. Some countries like it one way, some another. We have technology. We have science. We have humans who've, in their free time, just, one day, created calculus. Isaac Newton invented calculus one day, doing nothing else. After he was done inventing gravity, well, he didn't invent it, but he figured it out how it worked. And then you got Einstein and MC squared and Mozart. How do you account for Mozart? It just boggles the mind. But that is the kind and the level of thing of which humans are capable, because we have this thing called a nervous system that operates at an excessively high level. So there's your study guide for the science of perception. And we'll take the nervous system up again in the next 2 presentations. I know, no need to thank me.